Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author, Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I'm your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Amy Pease. Amy is an alumnus of the University of Wisconsin and the Madison Writer Studio and works as a nurse practitioner where she is nationally recognized HIV specialist. She lives in Wisconsin with her husband and 2 children, and Northwoods is her first novel. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh my God, thanks for being here. And this was such a fun read. We are now speaking on the day after Christmas, and I was up late last night finishing this because, of course, Christmas, made it hard to find the time. But what a thrilling read! Can you tell our listeners about Northwoods?
Yeah, Northwoods is a contemporary mystery thriller, and it's set in the Northwoods of Wisconsin in a fictional town called Shaky Lake, which is a really a common style of Northwoods lake resort town. And it focuses on Marge, who is the sheriff of the small town, and her son Eli, who's her deputy. And especially focuses on Eli. He is a military veteran going through a lot, to say the least. And he, in the course of one night's work, comes across the body of a dead boy, and then come to find several hours later that the boy's friend is missing. So then the FBI gets involved. It becomes a much larger case than Shaky Lake. And also this is all going down when Eli is really hitting rock bottom in his personal life.
Yeah, but I read on my yesterday on my podcast for my quote of the week. I read from the beginning of this, and normally I like to find a passage sort of in the middle, but that beginning passage where Eli is in the water, and like you said, sort of drowning in his metaphorically in his life, he's going through a divorce. He doesn't have as much access to his son Andy. It's really it sets a beautiful setup for him, and I love his vulnerability. And his mother says something later in the book when sort of talking about his father's deceased, was killed in the line of duty, and she talks about how he's always been such a gentle soul, Eli. And so we have this. His mom is this tough woman. She's tiny. I love the fact that she's a little tiny person. He's a bigger guy, but she's this tiny person, and she's the sheriff of this town where kind of everything is provided by volunteers, right? Like they get donated their uniforms and their food, and they're in the basement of some kind of rundown building on Main Street. Their budget is almost non-existent, right? And he had this huge job, a really successful job with Fish and Wildlife before he was deployed, and when he came back, the job was eliminated. His role was eliminated. So there's just this beautiful setup you do with who he is and where he comes from, and he's so sympathetic without ever, he never doesn't want our sympathy, and yet we love him kind of from the first pages, which I thought was such a wonderful thing you did, and so beautifully orchestrated. And I find it sometimes hard to really engage with a character so quickly. So congratulations on that. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
And the whole, the story. So let's talk a little bit about this is your debut novel, which, we know is a huge deal. Can you tell us a little bit about, was this the first book you've ever written? What was your sort of, if you don't mind telling us, your publishing, trajectory? How did you get here?
Yeah, the journey, right. So yes, Northwoods is the first thing I've ever written beyond, like an essay for college or something like that. So, but when I was a kid, my great grandpa gave me his first edition 1908 copy of Anne of Green Gables when I was maybe 8 or 9, and I read it and I loved it. And for anyone who's read the book, they know that Anne becomes an author. And so I thought, okay, well, that's what I want to do. and fast forward 30 plus years later, I finally got around to doing that. So, and just, because I know the question comes up a lot, well, where'd you get the idea for the book? For me, it was an exercise in boredom. So I tell my kids, they whine, oh, I'm bored. Okay, well, being bored is a great time to exercise your imagination. So I was really bored just on a commute to work, and I challenged myself to just think of a scene, any scene, and it was the opening scene of Northwoods. In fact, that scene is almost unchanged from the first draft. But anyway, as far as my publishing journey, I didn't go to school for writing or anything like that. I mean, I went the practical route, and I've been a nurse practitioner for 20 years. But I worked on Northwoods. It just right from the beginning felt very vivid. Like there was a story there in my mind that wanted to come out.
Yeah.
And so I took probably 2 years to write the first draft. I mean, I had a baby and I had another baby, and
they get in the way, don't they? Those babies, I tell you.
They do, more so than my job, because I also had a full-time job. I do still have a full-time job. And so very slowly I wrote that. And then I did the writer's studio, like a revising your first draft workshop, run by an author named Michelle Wilgen, who's amazing. And, 2 years later, I decided it was ready for beta readers. So I scrounged up like maybe I think 8 or 10 people to read it, and then polished it up, and then started querying agents, like very traditional trajectory of trying to get traditionally published. And that went very quickly. So I found an agent within about 2 months. And then we did a little bit more polishing, and then she sent it off to editors, and that also went very quickly. And I'm with Emily Bessler Books, which is like an imprint of Atria, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster. So it's really an awesome, awesome imprint to work for, because it's very boutique and yet has all of the resources and infrastructure behind the bigger publishers. And worked with my editor, Laura, on even a little bit more polishing, and they wanted it to be released in January. I sold it in June of 2022 and had to wait until January 2024. And the book was essentially written already when I sold it. So it's been a long time coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is, I mean, so I wanted, because first of all, how, I'm sure people have told you how extraordinary it is that you found an agent so quickly and that you found a publisher so quickly. And like you said, Emily Bessler's amazing. I love Emily's books. My friend Connor Sullivan is also an Emily Bessler book. He lives here in my same Montana town. But I think it's really interesting and important, and it clearly speaks a lot about you that you took 2 years to write it, and then you took 2 years to revise it, and then you did you did all the things first, because I think a lot of us, that first book, were like, it's done, it's ready, let's get it out, and I think the fact that you took the time, because you really only have one shot to make that first impression, which is, especially as a debut, if it's your first book and you're submitting it, I think taking that time and making it as good as it can possibly be, even if it takes an extra year, is really, really worth it. And that is, that's indicative of sort of your personality. Because I was like, let's just send it out, let's just, so my process was slower. I mean, it took me, I think there were 60 agents or 50 agents. It was a lot. I have stacks of rejection letters that are very deep, although this was back in the day when nothing was electronic. So I have them all on paper. But so this Northwoods, like, I've heard a little bit about, we have a, mutual friend, Hannah Morrissey, who's in Wisconsin. And she has that Black Harbor town, which is another sort of Wisconsin town. But this Shaky Lake is a very, for those of us who are not in Wisconsin and haven't been to the Northwoods, it is a very distinct, feeling. It feels very differently from like, a small southern town, or a small, northeastern town, northwestern town. You obviously grew up in Wisconsin, I'm guessing. Did you visit the Northwoods? Do people do that as kids? Is that sort of how
yeah, we call it, we call it, I mean, I'm from Green Bay, but it's called going up north. So, oh, we're going to go up north to the cabin, right? My family didn't have a cabin, but I know plenty of people did. And we would go up there and, rent a cabin or go camping or something like that. And it's the nostalgia of it. I think people would be amazed that places like this still exist.
Yeah.
In a good way. And I think of, my sister used to live in New York City and she lived in Brooklyn, and you go to all these like really hipster bars. They're just Northwoods taverns planted into Brooklyn, with the PBR and everything. That's just the way it is still. And it's just a really special place. Very, it's, I think nostalgic is probably the best word for it. And beautiful too.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It does sound like nothing is quite up to date. And then tell us about the FBI agent, because that was another really, I loved her. And I had the sense, and I hope I'm right, that there's another book coming.
Oh yeah.
Northwoods. Okay. You're like, oh yeah. Because I was like, if this is how we end it and I never get to see these people again, I'm going to be very upset. So
no, I think that, yeah, I wish that we had a way to make it clear that this was the beginning of a series, because there are a lot of like NetGalley reviewers that were like, this just ends like this? No way.
Yeah.
So,
well,
yeah,
and
it's a series.
It's readers are so funny, but it does absolutely tie. I want to be clear. It ties up the story very beautifully. What we're not done with is the characters, like you said. I mean, we're not done with Eli. And we're definitely not done. Tell us about the FBI agent, because she comes from Chicago. She's, to just give us a little introduction, because she's fabulous.
Sure. So, the FBI sort of shows up on the doorstep of this small town sheriff's department to, help out with the disappearance of the girl. And Alyssa is like a professional. Her job is her focus, and she's very smart. She's very, I would say she's very emotionally intelligent too. Like, she knows the little nuances of how to interview people and how to put pressure on people. And it comes into play not only with the investigation, but also in her interaction with Eli, which is important because, like I said, Eli is going through a really rough space. And sort of in an unlikely turn of events, Alyssa is one of the people who really kind of helps him turn it around. And that's a testament to just, I think, the connection that the two of them have right from the get-go. And also just who she is as an investigator, but also as like an empathetic person.
Yeah. No, she's wonderful. And I think she walks in the door and she looks like she's 20 and everyone's like, oh my God. And then it turns out, of course, she's been on the job for a decade and she's not at all 20. I mean, she's very young looking. And I like that there's a few hints we get about her, like, her clothes move, and there's clearly she's been injured, right? And there's a lot of things you plant that we don't get resolution to, which I think just speaks to the beautiful beginning of a series. And like you said, there's a connection between them that I know you will also explore, that I was just like, it was so, wonderful. And I think there's something, they're all damaged, right? I mean, Eli's mom, Marge, and we're going to talk about mothers and daughters, because of course our mothers and children, because this is Killer Women and I love to sort of really dig into the women. But before we leave Alyssa and Eli, she also definitely, and we learn very little about her life in Chicago. We learned a little bit about Jason. She's engaged. He's a rocket scientist. But there's so much more that we know is coming. And so one of the things I think is so impressive about your writing style is that you do give us this, we know there's a lot of depth, although we don't get it all. There's the promise of a lot of depth. And I think that sets up a beautiful, series style and sort of the archetype of these characters. And we know there's going to be a lot more things that come. So I'm just telling you, I thought it was fabulous.
Well, I think the backstory to me is what makes fiction really good. Like, when you read a book, I mean, there are plenty of books out there that it really isn't about the characters, and that's okay. But if you're writing character-driven fiction, like Northwoods is for sure character-driven, having the backstory at a really intense depth is so important. It makes all the difference. And I think of authors who clearly must have the most intense backstory with their characters. And those books always just blow me out of the water.
So do you feel like, so are you doing, when you go attempt backstory, it sounds like, the scene with Eli in the water was sort of your original vision. Did you then, do you do that where you go back and try to figure out sort of how did Eli get to this place? Obviously, we know he was in Afghanistan. Something really horrible happened there. And we do learn what that is in the course of the book. But I mean, besides that, which makes, we know, of course, from our personal experience about post, trauma and all of that. But what else, how else do you learn the characters? Because that's really what matters, is that the author knows the character so well that you can put in those little bits.
Well, Eli must have just lived in my head for years, because he was born with me fully knowing who he was. And the little details, like events in his life, I sort of just dreamed up, in between writing sessions. When I didn't have time to actually sit down and write, I would think about these characters and about the story a lot. But I've known him right from the beginning. And that was another reason why I felt like this story was worth putting the work in to write the book and see it through to the end.
Yeah. Now, is he somebody, do you feel like he's based on somebody do you have a personal experience with vets? Okay.
No, he in a way, he's a trope, like the wounded warrior, like the hero.
Yes.
He's such an absolute stereotypical hero.
Yeah.
And of course you have to, and I love that. I love books where you can really know that the protagonist is the good guy.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of anti-heroes, and those books can be great too, but I just wanted a story where that you can root for these people.
Yeah.
But that we can't make him just a stereotype, obviously.
No,
and
he's nowhere near perfect, right?
No, he's really a mess, really, really a mess, and messing up a lot of people's lives by being such a mess. But he started out as a little bit of a stereotype, and then I got to know him better. And I think that's the Eli that you see in the book and that you'll see in subsequent books. He isn't always going to be, literally or figuratively about ready to jump off a cliff,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So speaking of that, right, his mother, Marge, and he's an only child. And, we have these, we actually have these three kids and three mothers, all of whom had only children, right? We have this whole thing is set in the backdrop of the opioid crisis. So we've got, we've got these, dangerous drugs out there, things happening, and there's layers of that we won't talk about because they're so, they're so pivotal to the mystery part of it. And you have to read the book to get all that. So you want to go grab your copy. But we have these mothers and I keep saying that, mothers and children. So Marge, is the sheriff, and her son is Eli. And then we have, these other two. Tell us about that, because Ben's mother, Ben is the kid who is found dead. And then Caitlin is missing. And they're sort of friends but only in this town, right? They live in different places, and they visit this town in the summer. Right? This is their sort of summer spot. So, and those moms, are also raising these kids who are teenagers. So tell us a little bit about them, because I think they add so much depth to the story as well.
Well, parent-child relationships are something that most of us can relate to. And there's certainly something that I deal with every single day. I've got kids. So it's sort of just this forefront of your mind, like obviously your characters are going to have kids involved. And honestly, I hadn't really thought till you just mentioned it about how it's three mothers and their kids, they're single, they're only children. Yeah, and the differences and the similarities between those stories, between those relationships. Rachel is Ben's mother, and Rachel is suffering from addiction. And then we look at Caitlin's mother, Beth, and she seems to have it all together, and yet her husband has gone missing. And then Marge has this relationship with her son that's so great, but her son is floundering. So I think overall, when I was writing the book, my goal was to make it realistic, like because I think, sometimes there could be criticism of, well, not, some of this is a little bit far-fetched, but the truth is it really isn't. We all live with quite a bit of drama in our lives, even, when we have stable lives, and it's just human.
Right. Well, you compare Rachel, who's an addict, right, to like Marge, who's the sheriff, and you think, well, these are women with totally different, power dynamics, right? Marge is in charge, and Rachel is really falling apart, and her husband is, divorcing her, or yeah, her husband is the plan is to be divorced, and yet, like, really, when it comes down to our children, there's nothing that can kind of level us, right? It's the loss of a child, the fear of losing a child, the fear of a child hurting his or herself, and each of those mothers is dealing with that in a very real way, and it really does. I love the relationship, which we only get a little taste of, between Marge and Rachel. Rachel, who's been coming to the lake every year, and who's, was also a nurse, right? Rachel was a nurse, and her husband is a physician. And she basically was this really strong person, and she's lost her footing in a similar way that Eli has lost his footing. And Marge is there for her. She says, I'm here. If you need me, I'm here. And the way the community watched out over Ben, in particular, like Dan Simmons, who's just a one-off character. I mean, he's not actively involved in the plot. He's sort of he got in trouble early, spent some time in jail, was released, and he takes an active interest in Ben. And you can picture this tiny town where when people, when people come from the outside, there's probably a lot of people from the outside, but the ones who come over and over and over sort of get enveloped in the town as a family. And so people watch out for one another, even if they don't always see eye to eye on lots of things, right? Like the people at the Babes bait shop and and bar, where Alyssa
Babes
and
Bait
Eli,
and Tackle.
yeah, Babes Bait and Tackle, where everybody goes for where they go. Eli and Alyssa end up for a drink, and we learn a lot more about Eli by the way that people around him are. I just think that there's all these beautiful details that are sprinkled throughout, that in the end really do come together to sort of bring this town to life, which is really it's just absolutely beautifully done, and I enjoyed it. I'm really just gushing. I don't always gush, but I really
that's so nice of you. Thanks.
I really loved it, and I do really look forward to getting to know Eli. Can you tell us anything about the next book? I know sometimes the answer is absolutely no.
Well, I'm not under contract for it, so I suppose I could say whatever I want. So yeah, basically, after this book wraps up, Alyssa heads back to Chicago, back to her life. That's that. End of story. Except fast forward a year, and she's back in Shaky Lake for another investigation. And these all, it's a continuation of the big investigation that's uncovered in the course of book one, in the course of Northwoods. But she and Eli, I think that they accidentally found kindred spirits in each other. So that's something you can't just let go, it's gotta be the fundamental, I think, underpinning of the series.
Yeah, no, they had such a good dynamic. Okay, so we're going to talk about the publishing side of this for a little bit, because this is another sort of really, common scenario. Is you sold one book, right? You did a one book deal, and of course, everybody, they want to see how the book does, right? So obviously I hope they have the first right of refusal, right? You will submit the book to them. So, and this is another part of it, right? So you have to wait. Are you done with the new book?
No. I am on the second draft, but
okay.
For reference, like a finished modern novel is like 90,000 words. Northwoods is about 90,000 words. My first and second drafts are in the like 30,000 word range. So arguably they're just very detailed synopses. So I'm just getting to the point where I'm starting to fill in the blanks. But for me, coming up with the plot is the hard part, especially with mystery. And I really like complex mysteries where you're juggling a lot of different things, a lot of different breadcrumbs sprinkled throughout, and it all coming together at the end, which I hope I did with Northwoods. I mean, that was my intent.
Yes.
But to do that is hard. Like, does it get easier as a writer yourself? Can I ask, does it get easier?
I don't want to be discouraging.
But no.
In some ways it does. In some ways, like doing it, you know, I get whatever. I think I'm on book 16 or 17 or something like that. And in some ways it gets easier because you know you can do it, right?
Yeah.
And in some ways it gets easier because you find your community to talk to. I think fellow writers are really good at being, you know, you call in and say, I've got this problem. And sometimes just talking it out, you solve it, or they say like 2 words and you're like, oh, it's brilliant. That helps, you know. But no, also not, you know, also doesn't get easier. Sorry.
Right.
But one of the things I appreciate is that there is this sense in this crazy publishing world that you should have a book out every year, which is unsustainable, especially for somebody with, sounds like your children are young.
They're 2nd and 3rd grade.
Yes. Oh my God, I'm close together. So
well, my husband works full time too, so.
Right. So, you know, and of course, like we all know also that publishing doesn't pay enough for any of us to really retire very quickly. So, so basically, yeah, you have to be realistic. And I think sort of sticking to the idea that the quality of the book is more important than the speed of publication. Which I think is, you know, I think that's really admirable. And, you know, right now, I think for your life, it sounds like you're doing the book's justice, which it's a hard line to sort of hold, right? When everyone's like, when will it be done? And you're like, well,
and I think I hadn't thought of it until you mentioned it, but I think that the reason that that my publishing journey has gone fairly smoothly is because I did the work up front before I started querying. Like, I made sure but the finished manuscript is very similar. I think I added 1 scene because the plot, this was in like the copy editing phase where the plot wasn't quite fleshed out yet. And I was just like, oh my gosh, have I written myself into a corner? So I think especially with mystery series, there's definitely the pressure to put out a book every year. I aspire to that, but I certainly couldn't do it unless I was able to cut my day job way, way back.
Right.
You know, and that's my goal.
But
who knows when that's going to happen.
But look at like, is it Alan Eskins who wrote Defending Jacob? I mean, there are lots of people who don't put a book out every year, right? Who are very successful, write beautiful books, and they just don't. And I think that is something to sort of acknowledge. And as a reader, of course, readers are like, well, we love this book, we want the next one like tomorrow. But they also have to appreciate that, you know, that to have a book that is, you know, so well written and so intricate, like you said, the plot points are and you leave us open for, this isn't quite done. Parts of it are done. There's definitely a bigger, you know, this opioid crisis, and there's a pharmaceutical company involved, and there's things, you know, that are coming. And then, you know, and you leave us in a position where who we think at the end might be responsible kind of can't necessarily be responsible for all of it. I'll leave that very vague because I don't want to ruin anything for anybody. But so there's questions at the end in a way that is really that will have readers reading again. And you know, I think people who love series will, when the second book comes out, they will go back and revisit Northwoods before they dig into the second one, because they don't want to miss any of the sort of intricacies, and you will have lived in it, and you'll do the work so that we will be able to, the 2 books will tie together beautifully. So I have faith in Emily Bessler and her team to know that what you have here is really magical. So, but I think now you have to sort of like, you can enjoy this incredible rush of having the book out and all this excitement, and then you go back to your cave and do the work.
Oh, I know. I'm in my like library cave right now, because my kids are off school, and there's no way I could ever have an hour, you know, to myself to do this podcast interview. I definitely, even though the goal would be to do books at like quicker than once every 5 years, like this pace has been for Northwoods. I'm thankfully someone who, if it doesn't happen that fast, it's fine. I'm not going to lose sleep over that. I think partly the line of work I'm in as a healthcare provider, sometimes you just have to be like, well, we do our best. And understand that, keep it in perspective. It's easier to keep it in perspective, I suppose, when, you kind of put it in the whole grand scheme of life.
Yes, right. Exactly. No, that's so true. Well, and let's just talk for a moment about it sounds like you're an HIV specialist. How did you come to, how did you end up there? That's a really, fascinating.
So I've been doing that for about 8 years. And it's awesome. It's so is it wrong to say it's fun? The thing with HIV these days is that the medication we have is tremendous. I mean, you just take the medication and you live your same life. So it's awesome. But I've always been in practice with marginalized communities, with folks who have faced stigma. And I think one thing that's taught me is to push back against stereotypes. And especially with mental health and addiction, because it's just so common. It's so common. I challenge people to name a person who's never been affected by mental health or addiction or both. Whether themselves or a close loved one, it's relatable. It really is. And it needs to be talked about more. So, which is one of the reasons that I made Eli, he gets teased, Alyssa teases him at one point that he looks like a Disney prince.
Oh, right.
And he's this huge, like burly, like muscular
lumberjack
beefcake. He's a beefcake. Totally. Yeah, he's a lumberjack beefcake and very good looking. And I wanted to push back against the stereotype of what, an alcoholic looks like. Right. Because you just don't know. The stereotype isn't true. And it's natural to stereotype. That's just a human thing to do. But I wanted people to know that isn't the reality. And same thing with Rachel.
I was going to say,
everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Rachel too. And, and Dan Simmons being this sort of grizzly, like doesn't give a shit. And yet he isn't, right? He has this real soft spot. So there's all those, and I think that's right. I think one of the things I love about fiction is that it gives us a look into a world we would otherwise never know. It's, it's a man lives one life, a reader lives 1,000 lives, or whatever the thing is. I think it's so true. And I think for those of us who grew up in, not in a marginalized community, who had, all these, resources and lived, without such real hardship, it's such an important thing to understand what other people might be going through. And I think it gives us, a real insight into what the world needs, which is absolutely like support for people with addiction and mental health. And it is worse. It seems to me it's worse now than ever before, right? The way it impacts our kids.
Pandemic.
The pandemic, social media. I have, my children are grown-ish. They're 21 and 23. I mean, it is, it's a really hard world to live in. And we were worried about like the Cold War when I was, when I was in my growing up, and they have just a much different, life.
I know. I tell my coworkers, because I've got coworkers who are like your kids' age, and
I know
I'm just like, there wasn't the internet. There wasn't the internet when I was like growing up,
right?
Which I feel really kind of lucky to have seen
too.
That world too. And going back to the healthcare provider thing, with the pharmaceutical company that you mentioned that comes into play, I was in grad school and my early career as a nurse practitioner at the height of OxyContin. And I remember being at a lecture. This is University of Wisconsin. This is not, some shady place. A lecture where they taught us about pain management. And of course, it was all focused on OxyContin, really. And it was given by a well-respected physician, et cetera. And then did you see Dope Sick or read the book?
I haven't.
Okay, well, I started watching it and it was great, except for I had to stop. It was like a gut punch.
Yeah.
Even the names of the episodes, for example, were the fifth vital sign or breakthrough pain. These are all clinical terms that we were taught in school, and come to find out they were all manufactured by Richard Sackler to
Mm.
sell OxyContin, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
it's made me very cynical, but
Yeah.
also it's made me know the the depths to which, you know, big corporations will go, even in something that you would think wouldn't be touched by that, namely healthcare.
Right.
You know, and I remember when I showed my husband an early draft of the book, and I was talking about the bad actors with the pharmaceutical thing, and he was like, "That seems really far-fetched." Well, then fast forward a year, and the
Yeah.
whole Purdue Pharma OxyContin thing came out, and I'm just like, "See, you know,
I
you
mean,
you don't
right.
even have to make this up."
No, no, it's right. And it really is about greed. And it is so, you're right. Like if all the things that should never be impacted by money is the people's welfare. Um,
Mhm.
I mean, it's like, I don't know if you read Demon Copperhead.
Oh, yes.
I love that. And,
Mhm.
even Hillbilly Elegy. I mean, it is interesting, but I think it's right. I think it's important to know something about what is going on and to be skeptical. I mean, or even cynical, because it's like, you just
Mhm.
have to realize sort of who's behind these decisions that are made about, our healthcare, and we have to be able to advocate for each other and ourselves if we can, to make sure we're not getting, because I mean, the stories of like athletes and everybody who, people, they just get addicted to this stuff. And now we've got fentanyl on top of it. And I mean, it is
Mhm.
it is a ugly, ugly situation. And you're right. I mean, to be in the healthcare, you've gotten a front row seat um, to it. And like you said, you were taught. It was like you were indoctrinated in the idea that the best relief for pain management is medication.
Mhm.
And it is until it isn't, right? I
Right.
mean,
Yeah, it comes with a lot of guilt too, you know, and I didn't prescribe much OxyContin, but I certainly have.
yeah,
And I wouldn't have, I'm glad in retrospect that I went for the practical career first, right? So the nursing career as opposed to what I've always wanted to do, which is be an author. Because I wouldn't have been able to write this book. I
right.
wouldn't have anything different to offer, you know, because there are
Yeah,
a lot of books that talk about things like, you know, big pharma and whatever. But I just think having the perspective of someone who has been, you know, pressured by pharmaceutical sales reps and,
yeah.
you know, lied to,
And it
I think
turns
it
out
adds.
they might be lied to. I think this pharmaceutical sales reps probably got the same speech from there.
Oh,
It's a top down thing, right? So by the time the sales reps get to the doctor's offices, they believe what they're saying, or at least I think some
yeah.
of them do. And I think that's another, like of course you feel like these are people who are trying to make people well.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yeah, I agree with you. And also I think it's life experience, right? I mean, you're not 20 anymore. And writing a
Uh-huh.
book when you're 20 is, like you said, we just have less insight into the world as we do
Yeah.
as we get older. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, I think that's why a lot of really young authors probably write fantasy
yeah,
because there's not a lot of like real world experience to feed from when you're 20. And I
right.
think that's a great way to figure out how to, you know, create a world of your own then.
Exactly.
You know, that's not really what I would, that's not where I'm at. And I'm thankful for that. But
No, they're incredibly creative, but you're right. Like the
mhm,
actual, like, to take real people, and you can get away with more in a fantasy as long as you build your world, right? And a
mhm,
lot of fantasy, a lot of protagonists in fantasy are young people, right?
mhm.
They're teenagers, they're in their early, I mean, a lot of those protagonists end up being, young people trying to change the world, whether it's a different world maybe than the
Yeah.
world that we live in. But yeah, it's fun. And, I sounds like you as well, but I don't read very much nonfiction, which probably needs to be fixed, but
I don't either.
I just love fiction.
Yeah.
But I do read across genres, and it is fun to see the way that authors do things. And I think you learn something, I learn something from every single book I read.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it. So so your official, our interview is coming out on the 4th of January, which is going to be here before we know it. And this is out on the 9th, which means when you're listening to this, you have time to grab your copy of Northwoods. It sounds like, Amy, you're going to be in the parts of Wisconsin touring.
Yep. So the Madison area for sure, Milwaukee, Kenosha-ish, well, Waterford, which I had to look up where that was, to be honest. And then Minneapolis too, and Green Bay at some point.
Well, to tell us where we can find more information about you, do you have a website, or is your schedule listed on Instagram? Yeah. So what's the best place to figure out where you'll be for our Wisconsin readers?
Yeah. So Amy Pease Writes is my email, or is my website. And that has an event section that's all up to date. And so that's where folks can find where I'll be doing appearances. I have a couple of virtual events with the Poison Pen and this Mysterious Bookshop. Mm-hmm. So, for folks who aren't close to Madison or Milwaukee or Minneapolis, that would be a good opportunity to listen in. Although I think all of them are going to be streamed, as far as I know.
Perfect. So it sounds like you can go to Amy Pease, and I'm sure you'll amypeasewrites.com, and you can tell us. And you're also Amy Pease Writes, I noticed, on Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah,
I try. I've got I don't think I posted it yet. I've got a graphic that's got like tour dates on it that I'll put on there one of these days, in between pictures of like my puppy.
Oh, you didn't get a puppy for Christmas?
No, we got a puppy in September. So he's about 5.5 months old. He's such a good boy, but he goes to daycare and they have lots of pictures of him. So of course I have to post those.
Oh my God, that's so cute. Well, I love that. Well, as if life isn't complicated. I've got 2 puppies right here beside me, but they zonked out because, Christmas was a very big, busy day with lots of people. So,
well, my little guy, we also have a 13-year-old, and it's his great grandfather. So it's our little legacy puppy.
I love that. Oh, yeah. What kind of dogs are they?
They're Welsh Springer Spaniels. My mom's a dog breeder.
Oh, wow. How fun. Mm-hmm. Did you hear the word dog, Teddy? He was like, we'll just say hi.
I saw your dogs on your Instagram. Oh, look at.
Teddy just had back surgery. He said, poor guy.
Oh,
I know. That's why he has one chicken leg where the IV was.
With IV went in.
Yeah,
little guy.
He's only 3. Poor guy. He's had 2 back surgeries. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Oh, well, Amy, it was such a joy to talk to you, and I really love Northwoods. Thank you for a beautiful read. I cannot wait. I hope you'll keep me in line when the sequel comes, because I would love to read.
Oh, for sure. For sure. So. Well, I'm so pleased. Thanks so much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on the show. I really enjoy the podcast too. I like to hear about the killer women.
Thank you. Well, we are, yes, we are killer women. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today while I spoke with Amy Pease about her debut novel, Northwoods, which I highly recommend. It's out on the 9th from Emily Bestler Books. You can find it, I'm sure, at any of your local bookstores. If they don't have it, you have to ask for it. That's how we get the word out about wonderful books. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.